Welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Ed Searcy. Today we welcome one of the leading Christian theologians of the past quarter century. Dr. Jurgen Moltmann is professor of systematic theology at the University of Tübingen in West Germany. Welcome to Pressure Point, Dr. Moltmann.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if we could begin with your beginnings. I know that you were born in Hamburg in about 1926, I believe, and that means, by my calculations, that you were a youth during the Third Reich, in fact an adolescent during the Second World War. I wonder now, you're a theologian, and I wonder how it was that you came to choose that path. I think many of us assume that theologians are raised in Christian families, perhaps they have a minister for a father, but I wonder how your early experience shaped your decision to enter theology.
Well, the ways are mysterious. I'm coming from an enlightened family in Hamburg. The tradition of my family was Freemason. We went to church only once a year on Christmas Eve, as my father confessed later, to celebrate family life. But that was it. And as a young boy, I wanted to study mathematics and physics. But I was drafted to the German army in the last year of the war in order to die on the front. And then I was captured by British troops in February '45. And I had learned enough English in school to say to the first British soldier I met in the woods, I surrender, so I survived. And then came a long time in prison camps, first in Belgium, then in Scotland, and then in England, 3.5 years. And I remember at the end of '45, after the war, we were confronted with the pictures of Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz and Dachau, and at that time everything broke down in me. There was no culture in Germany which was not corrupted, no institution which was not corrupted. And so I lost all will to live and became very sick. And I think it was only with the help of a few Christians, a small group, that I got hope again and experienced not a sudden conversion, but a slow rebirth to a living hope. And I remember, was in August '45, that a British army chaplain came into our camp and distributed Bibles. At that time we wanted to get some cigarettes or something to eat, and so he left me with a Bible and I started reading it. There was an appendix with the Psalms, and the Psalms of Lamentation spoke to me first. It was Psalm 39. And then I was slowly drawn into the story of Christ, the Passion story. And when I read this, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I all of a sudden felt that he is my brother, expressing what I was feeling at that time. And so slowly this turned my life, and I decided to study theology. When I wrote a postcard from the camp to my father that I want to study theology, he wrote back on a postcard, but please don't forget to procreate the family. His suspicion was I'm becoming Catholic or a monk or something like that. So I became the black sheep of my family, but I didn't regret it.
Interesting how your own story is so caught up in a story of despair and of hope, of how your experience of the camps was very similar to the books that you've written and the theology that you've produced, which is much about despair and suffering and about hope. And I wonder sometimes if perhaps theology is autobiography, if the two aren't in some way intimately connected, not only for you but for others.
I believe if you dig deep enough into the heart of the theologian, you will find that he is speaking from experiences of his heart, even if he does not admit it or make an objective study of something. There's always, theology is an adventure with God. And it's always full of surprises, of insights and knowledge. But you have to risk your existence with it, your heart.
You talk about it being an adventure, and I think people often think instead of it being kind of a safe and secure ivory tower existence, far away from the real issues of life, without much to say about the real issues of life. And yet I sense that for you it's an adventure. It has to do with the world and its pain and with its people.
It's full of spiritual dangers, temptations, to give up the whole thing, to curse God and die, or things like that. Then you all of a sudden have an insight which helps you to live, which supports you. So my ivory tower was barbed wire.
Remember when the Theology of Hope was published in the mid-60s, how your experience and the theology that grew out of it swept across much of Europe and certainly North America and then around the world, almost like wildfire. It was a very popular work and seemed to ring true with other people, whether they'd been in prison camps behind barbed wire or not. Somehow that sense of despair, that need for hope, is a common factor that binds us together.
In the 60s that this book, Theology of Hope, was published, and the situation was that the reception was very good. But I was in the States 67 and 68 at Duke University, and I recognized how Americans received this book as a reinforcement of the officially optimistic society of the United States. And then I promised my friends whenever I would return to the United States, I would only speak about the cross and no longer about this optimism and hope and the way to success, things like that. So I felt how this theme could also be misunderstood.
If you jump to hope too fast, if you aren't in the midst of Good Friday, you don't understand the message.
Then it becomes a religion of hope and of success and of wealth as a proof of good hope. Huh?
Yes. I wonder if we could move to the present time and to the way in which despair is a reality in our own world. And I was struck as you talked about your own youth and your experience of adolescence, at perhaps the parallels that exist between your experience of the barbed wire and the camps and the experience of youth in the Western world today who aren't behind barbed wire and not in camps and yet perhaps sense the same kind of despair that you felt in that place. Or is it a different feeling?
Well, in the West European nations, we have a large sector of the youth, which is the so-called no future generation. This is their outcry. They are unemployed. Nobody wants them. They are testified day to day. They are not needed, and they are pushed around. And so their cry is protest and anger and self-destruction. And the slogan is no future. And I can understand these people very well. I think this is a crime the present generation is committing over against the coming generation.
By holding them out, by not giving them a space.
Yeah, by not providing them with jobs, and because to have work means to get self-respect, and therefore we have this hooliganism and the rocker groups, and we have them in England as well as in France, as in West Germany.
Yes. What would you say to those teenagers? What do you think it means for us to be the church? What message do we have to take to them?
I won't say nothing to them. I would try to live with them. And if they would accept me as a member of their group or so, then I would start to speak to them. I think they won't listen to parents or pastors or institutions and representatives of institutions anymore, but they would listen to peers. And therefore the youth groups are important for the mission of faith and hope today.
Living with rather than speaking to.
Yeah, right. It's especially in West Germany a failure of the church that the church is a church for the people but not a church of the people. So we are trying to taking care of everything, but we are not part of it. And we must first be a part of the situation, and then you can speak and they will listen to you.
Must allow yourself to experience the pain that they're feeling before you have any right to say a word. As you talk about the despair of the young people in your culture, I think about the arms race and the way in which we struggle in our culture with simply allowing cruise missiles to be tested in Canada. You, on the other hand, live with cruise missiles and others on your very territory, on your turf, and that becomes part of the experience of those young people as well as of unemployment. And I wonder what it means to be the church in that situation, to talk about hope and to live in the midst of those weapons. Imagine part of the No Future Generation is a response to that reality as well as to the unemployment.
Yeah, if you ask them and dig deeply enough into their consciousness, they will respond, first, that they feel the imminence of the nuclear catastrophe, an inferno, and also that the ecological crisis is growing, and then humankind may die out.
Yeah.
And that they may be the last generation. So there's a kind of apocalyptic feeling in these young people. Now we have outside of Tübingen, 20 miles away from Tübingen, a US Army depot with Lance rockets. These are the short-range missiles. And they are directed to Ulm and Munich. So in case that Russian tank groups would advance through the Danube Valley, we would then destroy Munich first and then Ulm.
Part of West Germany.
Yeah, of course. And when they arrive to Tübingen, Tübingen will be destroyed by missiles in Strasbourg.
So what does it mean to...
So it's suicidal. Every month we go to the depot and have a Christian worship on the barbed wire there. In face of the weapons of death, we praise the living God. And many people are coming there because they are concerned. So now we get the modernization of these short-range missiles so that they can reach Dresden and Prague. Yeah, it's like if you would put your missiles to Calgary in case that Russian troops would land in Vancouver, they would then destroy Vancouver. Yeah. What would you say to that? But that's our situation, in a situation we have to live with ever since the end of the war.
In that kind of situation, how does one speak about hope? What is it that one can say or do? What can the church be? What message does it bring?
Well, I work for the peace movement. I work in the peace movement in West Germany, and we have very close relationships to the peace groups in East Germany. And the two Protestant churches work together for peace in East and West Germany. This is one link between the two Germanys and between the two blocks. And for years and years, we were protesting with hope against hope. And now all of a sudden, Gorbachev came, and his great threat to West Europe is to take the Russian threat away. And now we are without breath, and nobody knows to do what to do now. Even that the peace movement would be successful, nobody of us really dreamt of. But I think it's coming now. And the reduction of arms on both sides will bring peace to Europe and the two Germanys. The German-German relations are today better than ever before. The family of my wife lives in East Germany, and we can visit them and they can visit us. We can send books now, and it's closer and closer to normality.
Yes. Yes. So you move from a situation where to hope is to hope in spite of all the obvious reasons not to a place now where it seems that there's some light on the horizon, some...
The art of hope is to expect the unexpected. In corners where you really expect nothing, the Kremlin, for example, after Brezhnev, and one old person after another, nothing changed at all. Everything was in iron and steel. And now all of a sudden Gorbachev is there. Yes. And makes an offer. I think the West should be very careful listening to him and take his words seriously and take him by his own words to get down from this armaments race. Yes.
You mentioned that hand in hand with the armaments is the environment, and the Canadian author Farley Mowat, who writes about conservation and wildlife, recently said that it's the Judeo-Christian heritage that's got us in this mess in the environment, that it's our biblical roots and our belief that we should have dominion over the creation that's got us into this problem. How do you see the gospel, the message of the biblical faith, speaking to the present dilemma that we're in?
We have to read our own tradition, the biblical tradition and the Christian tradition, carefully and critically. To say that the humans have dominion over the earth is only half of the truth. The other half is that the humans are part of the creation community and must not isolate themselves out of the creation community. Psalm 104 is a good example how to integrate humans into the creation community. And for this, I think we should also rediscover the wisdom tradition of the Old Testament, according to which the Spirit of God is in everything, in every tree, in every animal. So it's the Spirit of God, the life-giving Spirit, so that we live in a community of the Holy Spirit in creation. And if we destroy this and isolate ourselves out of this life-giving creation community, we destroy ourselves. Who loves wisdom loves life, who neglects wisdom loves death.
So what you're saying is that in our tradition, in our biblical and theological tradition, there's something else that we've been blind to all this time. That in fact, Farley Mowat may be right about the way in which we've fallen short, but that we do have roots, we do have a message to bring about the environment and about this creation.
There is God's ecology and ecological wisdom in the Old Testament, and this is the Sabbath legislation. On the Sabbath, humans and animals should rest. On the Sabbath day, one should not interfere with nature. So have one day without driving your car and polluting the air. This is the idea of the Sabbath day, and the Sabbath year is to give the earth a Sabbath. Every seventh year the earth should not be plowed and tilled, etc., but should lay fallow. And it is according to the Old Testament that Israel was brought into the Babylonian captivity because Israel neglected the Sabbath of the earth, and in order that the earth of God may recuperate and become to life again, the people of Israel had to be 70 years in the Babylonian captivity. So I think we should rediscover the idea of the Sabbath of the earth and respect this.
It's not just the Sabbath for us.
No.
For the environment itself too, for nature.
Even the Sabbath day is not only that humans come to rest, but they have one day without interfering with nature. So let nature be God's creation on one day per week.
We're talking about environment and armaments. Much of the world says we don't have the time or energy to worry about those things, about that apocalypse, because we're hungry and we have no shelter. We're starving to death. And your system, your world is to blame, or partly to blame. In the midst of that cry of despair, of the separation of the rich and poor, of the first and third worlds, how do you see the gospel speaking? What word does it bring to the poor and to the rich?
The World Council of Churches conference in Vancouver in 83 made the slogan, justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. And justice has priority, especially for the people in the third world, who suffer under injustice. Justice creates peace, and there's no other way to peace in the world but by creating justice. So what they need is not more food, but more justice. This is then a critique of our running world economy, where these countries are brought more and more into debt, so that in order to pay the interest, they have to chop their rainforests, which in the end will then have effect on us too, because these are the lungs of the earth, and they have to destroy it. So I think we have to rethink and reformulate world economy, and we cannot go on with this imperialism of the West over against the third world. It's short-sighted, and it will be suicidal for ourselves if we go on with bringing these people more and more into debt and exploit them and force them to destroy their own life basis.
Mm-hmm. You said that the gospel brings dignity to the poor, hope to the poor, and that the good news it brings to the rich is the joyful news of repentance. we don't often think of repentance in those terms. Usually it's more a bad news word than a good news word. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you see Christians living out their faith when they're living in the midst of the rich first world that acts unjustly towards the poor third world. What does it mean to be a part of the Christian community, trying to be a repentant people, to be wealthy in the terms of the world? How do you live with that?
Well, I and my family try to live a more simple lifestyle. I think the joy of living is not dependent on how much you consume. And we can reduce the use of energy because energy is taken by violence from nature, and to reduce the use of energy is to reduce violence. And we can work for, I think for overcoming the ideology behind our economy. In Germany we still believe that economy must grow. We believe in progress and growth. And if there is a year without any growth, we speak of zero growth, which is ridiculous, but there must be growth. And I think this is a wrong ideology. It's not necessary to grow in order to be alive. It is necessary to find more equilibrium in the exchange with nature and also between the different nations.
You mentioned the word violence there, doing violence to nature, and you've said that the original sin of humanity was not so much picking the fruit in the garden, but was rather violence, that Cain's murder of Abel was our original sin, and that in fact the spread of violence is sin in the world. I wonder, I often think that religion has been caught up in much violence in its history. We often have been to blame for many of the wars and the violence that's been done. I know that recently you've been involved in Christian-Jewish dialogue in Germany. And I wonder if you see that dialogue as something specific to Germany's needs at the present time, to deal with your recent and long-term past. Or if you see the dialogue between different faiths, Christians and Jews and other faiths, as something that's central to what we'll be about in the years to come.
Without peace between the religions, there can be no peace on earth. But religions have this claim of absoluteness. The Islam, via Khomeini, Christianity through the Pope, etc. And to have peace between different claims of absoluteness is very difficult, and I think we must work on it. Because we live in a common situation, there will be one world or no world. This is an old slogan, and this one world must now be shared by different religions. And either they arouse fanaticism against each other, or they come to a mutual understanding. I think we should start with bringing these three Abrahamitic religions together, Jews, Muslim, and Christians, because they have one father, and that's Abraham. Yes. And if we go back to Abraham and to his religious experience of Exodus, then all of a sudden we discover what we have in common. And the next step then would be to come into a dialogue with the East Asian religions, who are, to my impression, more religions of equilibrium with nature, and Taoism, equilibrium in society, and Confucianism, and the equilibrium of the soul in Buddhism. And to appreciate this would show us the limitations of our own religions, which are all historical religions, future-oriented religions, and therefore aggressive religions.
Past 25 years, there have been two critical challenges to Western theology, to North American theology and European theology, white male theology perhaps, that has come from the third world in the form of liberation theology, and from feminist theology. I know that you're married to a feminist theologian, and I'd be interested to hear your response to the challenges that those two theologies have brought to us, to our Western theology.
Well, the Theology of Hope may have had some influence upon Latin American liberation theology, but I do not make a claim because this is the first theology made out of Latin American experiences, and one must respect this. I had an exchange of letters, of critical letters, with my friend José Miguel Bonino in the midst of the 70s about the use of Marxism in theology. And I think with most, not all of them, but most of the liberation theologians, we could agree. Marxist analysis of capitalism, yes. Marxist therapy via socialism, no. The experiments in East European socialist countries are not very encouraging. And I think now more and more they discover that it were not the Marxist revolutionary groups, but the human rights groups and the civil rights groups who overthrow the military governments in Argentina and other countries of Latin America. So they are moving, I think, now more and more to human rights and civil rights groups. And this is the same in East European countries and in Soviet Russia. And I think this has a future as a movement. Now to feminist theology, I'm, so to speak, married with feminist theology. My wife is a strong feminist theologian in West Germany. I think one of the leading figures, and I am learning to read the Bible and the Christian tradition with the eyes of my wife. And this brings new points of view also to me, things I have overlooked with my male eyes, and I think it's a great enrichment.
I wonder
and not a threat at all to male theology.
So you see it as something that we should in fact welcome as perhaps an outburst of God into the midst of our life.
The promise of the Old Testament is when the Spirit is poured out on humankind, the daughters will prophesy. Where the daughters are prophesying in churches, this is at least a sign of the Spirit.
What does it mean to call Jesus the Christ? What does it mean to call on the Messiah? Or another way, what does it mean to follow him, to call oneself a follower of Christ?
To be reborn to a living hope, and then to confess Jesus as the Christ, the one who brings hope into this dying world, and at the same time to follow him on the way he is opening up for us. I think both things belong together, the confession and the discipleship. And for me, the discipleship of Christ means to go along on the way of peacemaking in this violent world.
It means to follow him on the way to the cross?
Well, it can mean that, of course. The promise was not from one success to another and to wealth. The promise is that he will be with us wherever we go on his way. And I think under the cross, in personal suffering and pain, we feel the presence of Christ stronger than in every other place. And therefore the assurance of faith comes where affliction is and problems are coming upon us, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Moltmann. There's much more that we could talk about, and it's been a real pleasure and a privilege to have you here today. Thank you for joining us on Pressure Point.
Welcome.
And thank you for joining us on Pressure Point. We hope to see you again next week.